you very much, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wajak Noongar Budja, and in a short minute I'll be introducing Mitchell Garlit, who will give us a welcome to country. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are co-hosting this with the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, and I want to now talk from the perspective of the Doctors for the Environment, whom I'm representing tonight. DEA formed in 2001, Healthy Planet, Healthy People was the aim, and medical professionals from all sectors, including medical students, formed the national organisation. The aim was to protect human health through care of the environment. Our major focus, of course, now is the devastating effects of climate change on human health. DEA provides the best and most compelling evidence to demonstrate the health benefits of clean air, clean water, biodiversity in nature, stable climate, and a sustainable healthcare system. Now, during COVID, you not only know what epidemiologists do, you can spell it, but science was valued and taken notice of, and weren't the politicians popular? I had hoped that post-COVID, which we almost are, that the science, particularly around climate change, would be valued. I am sincerely disappointed. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mentions mean temperature rises 1 to 2 degrees centigrade. Doesn't sound very much, does it? As an epidemiologist, what we need to look at is the distribution of temperatures and look at the daily rises in temperature that a 1 or 2 degree shift of that whole distribution would mean. And it means for Western Australia, Perth actually, it had 28 days over 35 degrees in 2021, and it's predicted to rise to over 40 days by 2030. We certainly had it in 2022. Now, all of Australia's top medical researchers and practitioners agree that climate change is the most significant health problem facing us in the 21st century. COVID was probably even part of a response to climate change and the way we live on the planet. So health is crucial to be considered in all climate policy, and that climate change should be considered in all health policy. Now, the DEA has a whole lot of recommendations, and you can go to their website to get more details, but the number one is cutting emissions, banning all new fossil fuel projects, end funding to the fossil fuel industry, increase the use of electric vehicles, and 100% renewables by 2030. Now, it's interesting, Australia is the only OECD country that I know with no population health institute, like a CDC, for example. And there is no centre for climate change and health within our Federal Department of Health. So what DEA and all of us are really demanding is a national strategy for climate change and health, at least a strategy, if not a whole institute, which includes risk assessment, mitigation and adaptation for climate disruption and the climate emergencies which we've been seeing lately. And you know about the Sustainable Development Goals. Australia's signed up to them, but they're not binding. An anguishing thing for me. So I believe there is no time for healthcare as normal. The health and well-being of all Australians is under threat. Young people, children, babies, and those not yet born are the ones who will have the most impact if we don't act now. So I hope those stirring words will get you all primed up to give us your wonderful answers. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Mitchell Garlit to give a welcome to country. Mitchell is a proud Wajak Noongar man. His father, the Reverend Garlit, was a stolen generation survivor who at age 7 was taken from his family camp and placed at Magamba Methodist Mission. Mitchell continues his work as a member of Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, the UARRCC, promoting the culture, rights and recognition of First Peoples and reconciliation between First and Second Peoples. How good it would be if we had taken aboard Aboriginal knowledge in the managing of this planet. Mitchell, warm welcome.
Thank you, Fiona. Hello, everybody. First, wanting to thank everybody for coming together. Wanting to pay my respect to my elders, both past and present, to my Indigenous elders, also wanting to pay respect to my non-Indigenous elders, to the second peoples of this land, your elders also, because if it wasn't for those that have gone on before us on their journey together, we wouldn't be where we are today. In language, I'm wanting to say kaya maminichi here and yining ngan boyje, ngan yunga boyje, and maman and awalon yining and wangin ngan murt kanyan, ngan barngin, ngan court barngin ngan boyje. And daman gaman gawain ngan karawort kulin ngan boyje. And nalong murt kanyan, ngan daman gaman ga kunyat murt ngan yurling kulunga. And what will a mort ngan yuat kul ngan kura ngan wadi ngan yuat kul ngan yunga boyja. What will a mort, what will a kulunga ngan yuat kul ngan wabin ngan boyja ngan yunga morn. But ngan court jup ngan yunga mort and what will a mort ngan dapukan ngan wort kulin ngan Pidgeon ngan dwonk ngan court barngin. And in English it says that a long time ago, our Creator, our God, allowed the dark-skinned people to look after this land. Our Creator said, if you look after this place, in return, it'll look after you. And Daman Gamanga is our old people of yesterday, who have been able to hold on to our culture, our language, to this very day, to continue for us and future generations to have a deep connection to this land. And what will amort ngan yuat kul is that our family and friends, they came from a long way across the water. They came a long way. They brought their families, their children, and they come and made a home upon this land of the Aboriginal people. And they came and made a home for your children and my children. They journey together, they work and play upon this land. And we've got one thing to do to make our contribution to that journey, and that is to listen. And Pidgeon and dwonk and court barngin is that as we journey together, we have to listen not only with our ears, but with our hearts for a better tomorrow for the generations to come. Ngan court, ngan jup, ngan nunakut, ngan yuat kul, that my heart is happy that we've come together at this time to share. So welcome and thank you.
Mitchell, Mudich, Mudichnunga. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Mary Phaeton, who will be the MC for tonight, and introduce everybody else. Mary Phaeton is a wonderful woman, perfect for this. She's a highly experienced freelance interviewer, facilitator and podcaster. She is the founder of WA Climate Leaders, a group of WA leaders and experts whose purpose is to create courage through community for those whose decisions can have far-reaching impact on climate change. Formerly a producer of news and current affairs radio at ABC Perth, her clients have included the Perth Writers Festival, Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries, Department of Health, PICA, and the Disrupted Festival of Ideas. Welcome, Mary, and thank you very much for agreeing to MC tonight.
Thanks so much, Professor Fiona Stanley. I think this is a career highlight for me, being introduced by you. It feels like it should be the other way around. So thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be able to participate, and thank you, Mitchell, for that beautiful welcome. I think it would be quite a revolution if we would actually start leading from the heart as well as from the head. And I would like to acknowledge the privilege of being on Wajak Noongar Budja tonight as well. To begin this evening, we're going to hear from representatives from our host, the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, the ARRCC, the Public Health Association of Australia, PHAA, the West Australian branch, and the Australian Medical Association, AMA. Now, I'm not quite sure whether Ian Tozer is with us just yet, so I'm going to go firstly to Lizzie Connor, if you don't mind, Lizzie. Lizzie is the president of the Public Health Association of Australia, WA branch. She is currently the Senior Policy Officer, Mental Health and Public Health at the WA Association for Mental Health. She has a medical background and has held roles in clinical practice, public health policy, advocacy, research, management, and education. She's particularly interested in prevention of mental ill health, cross-sectoral and social determinants-based approaches, and health literacy. Lizzie is going to speak on behalf of the PHAA now. Thanks, Lizzie.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Mary. As mentioned, my name is Liz Connor, and I'm the president of the Public Health Association of Australia, WA branch. And thank you to DEA and the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change for inviting us to speak tonight and to be part of this event. I'd also like to recognise that we're meeting tonight on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja to share our gratitude for this beautiful place and to pay respect to our elders past and present. PHAA WA is committed to addressing climate change as a key public health issue in WA. As a branch, we recognise the important role that climate plays in health and wellbeing and the responsibility of the health sector in addressing climate change. We included acting on climate change as one of our 6 key asks in our 2021 state election platform, and we continue to keep action on climate change as one of our key advocacy priorities in our current work and also into the future. PHAA WA supports our national positions on climate change and health. We recognise that climate change is a health emergency, and action to ensure a safe environment and climate is a critical and urgent public health priority requiring evidence, advocacy, and policy guidance. The effects of climate change are novel, far-reaching, and complex, and require public health action beyond traditional approaches. A safe environment and climate are core determinants of human health, along with the socioeconomic and political structure of society and the multitude of individual and organisational factors affecting health and health services. PHAA advocates that response measures must rely fundamentally on mitigation to restore a habitable climate. However, the inevitable ongoing and intensifying warming necessitates societal transition to adapt and prepare for the coming storms, floods, fires, heat, droughts, and sea level rise. We formally recognise that government should facilitate adaptation and provide active assistance to those least able to adapt on their own, such as transitioning to renewable energy and a low carbon economy, promoting energy efficiency, reducing energy demand, and pricing carbon. And at a state and national level, PHAA is committed to supporting and encouraging Australia's public health community to initiate new and traditional public health actions that address climate change and promote wellbeing, including increased uptake of physical activity, so things like active transport, improving community amenity, so things like green spaces, and also healthier diets. And through the Vote for Public Health election campaign, PHAA is focusing on climate change action as a key priority in the forthcoming federal election. Australia needs a suite of measures to curb emissions and adapt to higher temperatures in ways that protect and promote health. And PHAA's key asks include that government should develop, implement, and enforce an integrated and comprehensive suite of policies to mitigate and adapt to climate change in ways that protect and promote health, and that government should drive the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy through the development of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and energy demand reduction. And as such, our state branch in WA will continue to advocate to government to act on climate change as a key priority for the health and wellbeing of our community. And we encourage all of tonight's candidates to ensure that climate change action is a central pillar of their policy direction and their vision for the WA community, not only now, but into the future. And we look forward to hearing more about their plans for addressing climate change tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth Connor from the PHAA branch. I'll now return to our original order. It's my pleasure to introduce the Reverend Dr. Ian Tozer. Ian is minister at the All Saints Floreat Uniting Church. He was ordained as a minister of the Word in the Uniting Church in 1982 and has served in numerous congregations across Western Australia, as well as senior roles in the Synod of Western Australia. He's here on behalf of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, the ARRCC, to give a brief introduction as to why climate action is an important issue for people of faith. Ian.
Thank you. Thank you to Mitchell, to all who've arranged the event and all participating. I speak tonight not only on behalf or as a representative of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, but also as an elector of Curtin. So I have a personal interest here. The ARRCC has members from a range of religious groups. I'm speaking as a Christian. In the Genesis parables of creation, God calls creation good, and all life is a gift. Humans are made creative to care for and to value all that is also created. Human life is a good, and all humans are called to do good. However, these parables also warn us that we humans tend to overstep our bounds, to act violently, and to avoid responsibility. Biblical traditions, in the face of those shortcomings, call people back to God and to live in ways that look beyond ourselves to the needs of others. Biblical traditions also make clear that it's not simply about the individuals who are addressed by God, but also communities and, of course, even nations. Jesus taught out of the Jewish tradition when he said we ought to do to others as we would have them do to us. Most faith traditions have a version of this principle, and indeed secular ethical traditions do also. Faith is not required to live by the principle, do no harm. The challenge for me in the teaching of Jesus is the actively doing good. I heard about the greenhouse effect in the 1970s in church, and my teachers made clear that while we needed to respond as individuals, wider cooperation is always important. When it began in 1977, the Uniting Church said, "We are concerned with the basic human rights of future generations and will urge the wise use of energy, the protection of the environment, and the replenishment of the earth's resources for their use and enjoyment." Our church has continued to look to future generations. Our relationship with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress has taught us much about seeing creation as God's gift. And personally, hearing from Pacific Islander Christians about the loss of water supplies and the loss of their vegetable gardens because of sea level rise has had a direct personal impact on me. And of course, valuing creation means we think about the other aspects, not just climate change in the broader sense, but also the loss of native habitats, the extinction of species, rural land degradation through salt, coastal erosion, as well as the obvious effects of climate change, such as fires and floods. Recently, Australian churches, or the heads of Australian churches, called for urgent action on climate change, including reducing carbon emissions and promoting renewable energy. I share their concern. I see this as a priority, and it will affect my vote. For me, it's a matter of life and death. Climate change, or better still, I think, global meltdown and flirting with ecological collapse, affects everyone on Earth. So it's not just for me, it's also for my family, for my neighbors, in the broader sense, for my community, for my country, for my church, for my world, and those in business, those in corporations, and those in government have specific roles to play. Global meltdown matters for me as a person of faith because God loves the world and all living beings. Life is a gift, and the gifts of creation need to be used wisely and well. The Bible always calls Christian people to look beyond the here and now and past ourselves and our wants and our needs. One of my favorite expressions is, remember the future. For me, that's why we meet tonight.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Ian Tozer from the ARRCC. And I should also acknowledge, I know, Liz, that you have to leave at some point. So thank you. You go when you need to, but thanks so much for your contribution this evening. And finally, now to the AMA and Dr. Kate Noonan. Kate is the current Vice President of the AMA WA. She is a public health registrar with the WA Health Department and has previously held a lead policy and research role with the AMA WA and has done management consultancy work in the UK in the healthcare sector too. Dr. Noonan is a graduate of the UWA Medical School and has further qualifications in global health from the University of Oxford. I'll hand over to you now, Dr. Noonan.
Thank you and good evening. My name's Catherine Noonan. I'm a public health registrar, as Mary said, and one of the AMA WA vice presidents. And I'd just like to thank Doctors for the Environment and ARRCC for convening tonight's forum on what is, or at least should be, the most critical issue at play in this federal election, and for the invitation to speak tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I too stand on Whadjuk Noongar Budja and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as a public health registrar, I, along with most of you, can attest that the last 2 years have really been dominated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, this was and continues to be a significant challenge for public health, exposing and accentuating a lot of the inequities that exist in our society. However, climate change represents the single greatest existential threat to the future of humanity. The direct effects of climate change, which we'd all be aware of, including injury and deaths from increased heat, flood, fires, drought, increased storms. Indirect effects then, including adverse changes in air pollution, spread of disease vectors, lost work capacity and labour productivity, food insecurity, displacement and mental ill health. And the disproportionate burden of these health impacts of climate change fall on those who are least responsible and least able to adapt. Is not only a policy challenge for government, but a global moral challenge that all Australians must respond to. Recognising the threat to human health and the inevitable strain on our already stretched health system, the AMA, along with DEA and many medical colleges, have urged Australia to act immediately and significantly lift its commitment to bring climate change under control, to save lives and protect health. As doctors, we see and understand health threats posed by climate change, and Australians are experiencing these impacts on an increasingly regular basis. The AMA, for its part, has been advocating for action on climate change for many years now, and in 2015, the Federal Council of the AMA recognised climate change as a health emergency, acknowledging that clear scientific evidence indicates that it will have severe impacts for our patients and our communities now and into the future. As those here will probably know, the health system itself accounts for 7% of Australia's carbon emissions, and the health portfolio in WA contributes the greatest proportion of carbon emissions of all portfolios. We are a significant player and we have a responsibility to make changes to how we do business as usual. In fact, many doctors have already commenced local action within their health service or department to curb their carbon footprint. Going further, the AMA calls for the development of a national sustainable health unit to coordinate efforts to reduce emissions and increase the sustainability of the health sector. At the state level, the AMA WA branch started formal meetings in 2021 and now meets quarterly with parliamentarians, senior health execs, and representatives from the medical colleges to discuss and develop action on climate change within the health sector. We're no longer just talking about the problem, but we are being part of the solution. However, what's glaringly missing from this picture is a commitment at a systems level from our leaders, and none more so than the federal government. Action to date has been less than ideal, with Australia ranking poorly among a number of scorecards, and initiatives to introduce meaningful change across climate policy have been actively undermined by the federal government. The AMA has called for regional and national collaboration across all sectors, including a comprehensive and broad-reaching adaptation plan to reduce the health impacts of climate change. This requires a national strategy for health and climate change. It should also be acknowledged that responding to climate change represents an opportunity to improve the health of all Australians. A society free of fossil fuel consumption is healthier with less exposure to air pollutants, for example, which is of major importance for public health. Building health systems that are climate resilient and environmentally sustainable would not only help reduce the health impacts of climate change, but circling back to COVID, would also contribute to minimising the risk of future pandemics. In the 2021 budget, which outlined our federal government's COVID-19 recovery, climate change is notably absent. However, the so-called gas-led recovery is a key feature and provided an additional $58 million in the 2021-22 budget. The pandemic presented a once-in-a-generation opportunity to progress towards reducing carbon emissions, both through changes to our pattern of behaviour, but also through its demonstration of government's ability to marshal and deploy resources expediently. Climate-related crises are already a reality. The question is, how do we act now at this inflection point? We need a unified national approach to mitigation, preparedness and response to climate change events to protect the health and livelihood of our population. The AMA looks forward to hearing from candidates as to how they will lead the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine Noonan, and that wraps up an unequivocally strong foundation for this conversation with the candidates for Curtin. Before I introduce them, I'll just let you know what the format is for this webinar. Each candidate, first of all, will be given 4 minutes to introduce themselves and present theirs or their party's climate and health policies and their vision for climate action, prompted by a focus question, which I'll present shortly. After that, we're going to have more questions where each candidate will be given 2 minutes to respond. All candidates will respond to all questions in a round robin fashion, with a different candidate responding first in turn. So the time limits will be really strict, and our timekeeper is Janelle Sewell from the DEA. She'll write in the chat when your time is up with a 30-second warning prior. There is obviously opportunity for questions from the audience, and that will arrive to us via the Q&A function and be sent through. And of course, the webinar is being recorded as well. And so now to welcome our participating candidates for the federal seat of Curtin in alphabetical order. Kate Chaney is the independent candidate for the seat of Curtin. Kate lives in West Leederville with her husband Bill and 3 children. She has deep family connections in Curtin. Her prior employment includes work with an international consulting group as a strategic advisor in the aviation, financial services and non-profit sectors. At Wesfarmers Limited, she worked as Aboriginal Affairs Manager and as the Sustainability Manager. Later, she was Director of Innovation and Strategy at Anglicare WA, overseeing strategic planning and driving innovative approaches to positive social change. Welcome, Kate Chaney. I'd now like to introduce Cameron Pidgeon, who is the Greens candidate for Curtin. He is a father, a teacher and an activist who has lived in Curtin for most of his life. He's been a stay-at-home dad for the past 4 years and says of the experience, "I understand how caring for a child changes your life." Hear to that. He's helped run the Mossman Park Playgroup and other community organisations and recognises how valuable volunteering is. Welcome, Cameron Pidgeon. And welcome to Yannick Spencer, who is the Labor candidate for Curtin. He is a long-time local in the Curtin electorate and lives in Mossman Park with his wife and 2 children. He's worked for a global management consulting firm, predominantly in energy and natural resources, focusing on climate and sustainability work. He's an experienced management consultant with 5 years of consulting experience across Australia and internationally. He holds a Master's in Public Policy from the University of Oxford and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UWA. Welcome as well to Yannick. Candidates, as I mentioned to you, you'll each have 4 minutes to introduce yourselves and respond to this question, which has been posed by the AMA, and I'll be inviting Kate Chaney to respond first. The health profession understands climate change to be the single biggest health threat facing humanity. Faith groups are concerned that those most vulnerable will be those most impacted. The latest IPCC report from Working Group 3 calls for rapid, deep and immediate cuts in CO2 emissions. What will you or your party do to ensure we limit warming to below 1.5 degrees and protect the health of Australians from climate change impacts? Kate Chaney, your 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mary. So yeah, I'm an independent candidate, and you've described my background a bit. I have 4 platforms that I'm standing on. One is immediate action on climate. Secondly, integrity. Thirdly, economic opportunities, and lastly, inclusive communities. So needless to say, climate action is right there high up in my list. I think our two-party system has really failed us on climate action. For 10 years, it's been tossed around like a political football, and it's become really hard for either of those major parties to do anything on it. So I think we really need to break that gridlock and have some independent voices to prompt some different action. The real challenge with climate action, and I'm not going to spend any time convincing anyone in this call that it's important, because I think we're all on the same page there, but the real challenge is with this sort of a systemic issue, you need to be able to speak multiple languages, because there will be different things that inspire different groups to act. And it will require a systemic solution that collaborates beyond party lines and country lines and any other divisions. When I was sustainability manager at Wesfarmers, I was trying to shift the sustainability function from being a reporting function to a strategic function, and working with a microcosm of the Australian economy across retail and chemicals and even coal to develop our position on climate. And I think it's that collaborative thinking that we need to see. I face this dilemma that it is possible that in 3 weeks I may be one of a small number of independents who hold the balance of power and have been elected on the basis of climate action. And it's really hard to work out what are the actions that you would request of either major party to provide support to form government. They need to be broad enough to be impactful and specific enough to be actionable. On my list, and it will be no doubt a complex negotiation, but firstly, setting a target that is in line with the science for 2030, which is a 50% minimum target on my policy. I think that's the first thing we need to do. The people who speak economic language know that if you set targets, things get done. Secondly, I think the Zali-Steggall climate change bill is a really good place to start. It's necessary, but not sufficient, in that we need to get the politics out of the planning so that the experts can get on with making plans that make sense. That body would review targets, develop a risk assessment for the country, develop an adaptation plan, and then also mitigation plans sector by sector, including the health sector. Beyond that, we can stop subsidies for fossil fuels to make a level playing field and actually enable some of the innovation in energy, for example, to provide us with the economic opportunities of the future. And then there would be specific initiatives, probably starting with energy and transport, that could be developed. And there's a list of those that I don't have time to go into now. But it's that sort of suite of things that I think will form part of the conversation or the negotiation that I would be having if I did find myself holding the balance of power. If not, they are the things that I would be advocating for. And I think whether the language that speaks to you is health, religion, economics, parenting, innovation, corporate leaders, there are many ways to frame this and the reasons for it, and being able to toggle between those languages is going to be really important to get the action that we need in this decade.
Thanks very much for that, Kate Cheney. I'll now pass over to you, Cameron Pidgeon, for your response to this question. Would you like me to repeat the question? You're okay, Cameron?
I've got it here in front of me, so that's fine. Thank you, Marie. So thank you, Marie. Thanks everyone else for coming along tonight. It's really good to know so many people are engaged in this issue. Thank you to the DEA for organising it. It's good to have an opportunity to speak to everyone like this. And thank you to Mitchell for the invitation to country from the heart. It's appreciated. I chose to run for the Greens because I've always been aware of our obligation to each other and to the effects our lifestyle is having on our planet and the way we live, our ability to keep on living and enjoying our lifestyle. It's been the only party I know of that's really addressed everything. It came about that way when the Greens started. We realised that we couldn't just be an environmental party. We had to make sure that if we wanted to progress, not just with environmental issues, but the peace issues. One of the founding parties of the Greens Party was the Nuclear Disarmament Party. All those sorts of broader things we can progress on, but we have to bring people with us. We have to make sure everyone who is otherwise vulnerable in our society has an opportunity to move, to come forward and to participate in the with our lifestyle. We can't just say, okay, we're going to reduce fossil fuel emissions without considering the impact that's going to have on people who are otherwise already doing it tough, for example. So looking at the way climate change is affecting, or is already affecting how we live, we know that it's rainfalls, decrease in rainfall is already affecting our food supply, our food security. The fresh water supply in some parts of the world has been affected. The habitat of wildlife, we don't see it as a direct thing that influences and supports our lifestyle, but we're noticing with COVID, which probably isn't, we don't quite know sure, isn't a disease due to climate change, but it's a kind of thing, it's like a warning. We know that as we encroach on the natural world, destroy habitats, species have to move out. We interact more with species we've never interacted with before. So the bats, which probably gave us COVID in China, is the kind of thing that we can look forward to in a not so good way. And there's also the direct effects on health with the warming. So far, we've been lucky. The warming has reduced the deaths from cold, but soon we're going to start to see that overtaken by deaths from heat stroke. But in Australia, we've seen health effects with the fires, the impact on cardiovascular and respiratory health. The floods we've recently seen in the east have been spreading disease. Been reporting skin rashes and other infectious diseases spreading with the contaminated floodwaters. And when you look at the social model of health, that's where we take into account our social and environmental factors and how they impact on our physical and mental well-being. The cumulative stress from an unhealthy or traumatic environment increases over the effect of other diseases, chronic illnesses. We've got, and it's not just now, of course, we're looking at several generations of people who are going to inherit a less livable planet.
Thank you, Cameron. That's your time now.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much. Moving on now to Yannick Spencer from Labor, if you'd like to respond to that first question, please.
Certainly, thanks, Mary. And I'd like to thank Doctors for the Environment and the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change for organising tonight. It's great to be here. And thank you to Mitchell for the welcome to country, and to Professor Stanley and Catherine and Lizzie for and Reverend Tozer for the introductions. So look, the IPCC is really, really clear. We are in a climate emergency, and the Australian Labor Party acknowledges that. We are happy to say the words climate emergency. For me personally, I've been involved in climate change for a long time. So I was on the fringes of COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, which was a deeply disappointing outcome. I volunteered at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, which is actually where I met my wife. So I volunteered there for a year in 2011. I wrote my undergraduate thesis in the political science of climate change. Why don't people believe in climate change? And the answer is basically because conservative politicians tell them not to. The lowest point for belief in anthropogenic climate change in Australian history was in the month after Tony Abbott became leader of the opposition. So I think let's let that sink in for a second. I did a master's degree at the University of Oxford, where I did a master's in public policy and chaired Oxford's COP21 conference, the simulation of the Paris conference. And now I work in management consulting, primarily in energy and natural resources, where I do a lot of work in climate and sustainability. So I personally have spent an awful lot of time looking at climate change, working in climate change, and it's a thing that I'm personally really passionate about. So talking about Labor's policies, the centrepiece climate policy for Labor is the Powering Australia policy. So what this is aiming for is a cut in carbon emissions or carbon equivalent emissions by 43% by 2030, which is almost double what the current government are proposing. And basically, it's a pretty simple policy with lots of different components, but the basics of it are decarbonise the electricity sector as fast as possible, and then electrify everything as quickly as possible. And doing those things buys you some time to deal with the hard to abate industries like cement and fertiliser manufacturer and those sorts of things that are harder to abate than the electricity sector and transport. So we're going to invest in transmission infrastructure to get more renewables online. So aiming for 80% renewables by 2030 in the NEM, not in the Swiss. The Swiss are probably closer to 100. And we recognise that economics will take care of coal. Most coal generators don't make money currently. But what the market won't do and what economics won't do is create the incentives to invest in really high penetrations of renewables or resolve the technical issues that you get when you have those very high penetrations of renewables, because renewables are cheaper. Renewables are just cheaper than fossil fuels right now. But when you have lots of them in the network, it makes the network challenging to run. And that's why you need to invest in that transmission infrastructure. The next part of the policy is to invest in things that are around equity, around renewable energy. So some people can't afford solar panels on their roof. 1 in 3 houses have solar panels, but some people live in apartments, some people rent, etc. So we want to invest in solar banks and community batteries, which give people who can't put solar panels on that opportunity as well. We want to invest in electrified transport. We have discounts on electric cars, investment in charging infrastructure, so that 90% of new vehicle sales in 2030 will be electric. And finally, we want to actually enforce the safeguard mechanism that's in the current coalition policy and has never been enforced.
Thank you very much, Yannick. Nicely timed there. Thank you to all 3 respondents on that first question. I now have a question from the audience from Jeff. The question, and I'll go to you, Cameron, on this one first. The people most affected by climate impacts are those with the least capacity to adapt. Heat waves have been responsible for more human deaths in Australia than any other natural hazard, particularly among the elderly and other vulnerable groups. A recent survey of how people cope with hot weather by the community-based Sweltering Cities found that nearly 62% said concerns about cost stopped them turning on their air conditioner. 47% of renters will leave the house to go to a cooler location. So the question is, how will you support the most vulnerable to access and afford safe housing and essential services? Cameron Pidgeon, you have 2 minutes this time.
We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to afford the renewable energy, but also that they can afford housing, that's appropriate for the new climate regime. So we'll fund, for example, we're going to fund a new housing build for affordable housing for in the order of 1 million houses. This will be over 10 years. But that will get the industry going towards building sustainable and climate-friendly housing where you don't have to spend so much energy to have a comfortable climate. Things like reverse cycle air conditioning, which is the most efficient way to keep cool. We'll look at subsidising that. That'll be part of the electrification program, where we'll subsidise things like electric cooking, electric water heating, heat pumps. And we want to, through leadership at the federal level, something the state policy thing, the federal government can do a lot with funding, redesign the way our cities are built. So we have preserve our open space, our green space, reduce the amount of paving we need. We want to make sure that any new development, housing, increase housing density, but only in concentrated areas where it's going to be most useful, especially for people who need affordable housing, but avoid paving over green spaces, especially what's left of our urban bushland, in order to achieve that. And if anything, we need to increase our green cover in our urban places, preserve what we've got, require a certain amount of green space in any development, and make the cities livable for people in other respects, like transport, access to shops, access to education.
Thank you, Cameron. That's your time now. Can I move on to Yannick Spencer? How will you support the most vulnerable to access and afford safe housing and essential services?
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to I think was it Jared for the question. Sorry,
yes, yeah.
Yeah, so look, it's a great question, and it is it is an unfortunate fact that vulnerable and poorer people are the people who are most likely to experience the impacts of climate change and to not be able to afford to do something about it. And that's part of the policy that I was talking about earlier with Labor's commitment to equity. So things like solar banks, which is essentially a community solar farm, where people who are not able to afford the upfront capital cost to put solar panels on their roof can buy into a solar farm, which guarantees them cheaper energy, as well as supporting the installation of additional renewable energy. So people who can't afford solar panels, people who live in apartment buildings, people who rent, people who move around frequently, who can't access the genuine miracle of rooftop solar, which has transformed the electricity sector in this country. People who can't access that can access a solar bank, and likewise, people who can't afford to put a battery on their house can access the community battery program that Labor wants to bring about. So we'll install 400 community batteries around the country. So all of these are geared at transforming the electricity sector, but also giving people who can't currently participate in that opportunity the ability to participate without cost ever being a barrier. Our policies are also going to make power cheaper. So people who look at their bank balance before they think about turning on the air conditioning, our policies will make power cheaper so that people don't have to make that trade-off. And we also want to invest in community housing with really, really high environmental standards and energy efficiency that is not gas plumbed, that's using heat pumps, that's using electric or induction cooking, so that people don't have those gas appliances in their home. We want to have that as the standard for our community housing build. I think I'm out of time.
Pretty much, yeah, thank you very much. And Kate Cheney, to you on this question, how will you support the most vulnerable to access and afford safe housing and essential services?
I've spent the last 4.5 years being Director of Innovation and Strategy at Anglicare WA and advocating on housing for people who are more vulnerable. And certainly at both a local and an international level, it's true to say that people who are already vulnerable are likely to experience the worst of climate change, whether that's people in low-lying countries or people who don't have access to some of the the advantages in terms of housing and where they live within Australia. So social housing, meeting social housing supply is another one of the big challenges that we're going to have to face in the coming decade or two, and ensuring that social housing supply as it comes on is energy efficient and complies with requirements for that energy efficiency will both have environmental benefits but also cost benefits for people living in social housing. And I think broadly there are changes that can be made to building standards to ensure that all buildings comply with those energy efficiency requirements going forward, which will be part of an overall transition that we'll see. So making sure that we do actually have housing for people is a start, and then ensuring that housing gives both the environmental and the financial costs of energy efficiency. I'll leave it.
Thank you. Moving on to another question from the audience. This is, Australia has 72 new coal, 44 new gas and oil, and several new gas basins under development, and they are actively supported by governments, including through large subsidies. The International Energy Agency states there can be no new fossil fuel projects if we are to achieve net zero by 2050. How should we view our state and federal government's emission reduction pledges in light of this? I'll go to Yannick Spencer, Labor, first of all.
Yeah, again, thanks for the question. And I am very aware of what the IEA state, because my brother actually helped write that report. So he's constantly talking to me about it. Yeah, so look, Australia is a fossil fuel rich country. We have an awful lot of coal, we have an awful lot of gas, and we export the vast majority of it. We don't consume anywhere near the majority of it here. So in terms of the projects that are under development, if you look at the history of projects under development, I personally would be incredibly skeptical that any of these projects will actually happen, because there is not a market for it. There is not shareholders for it. Nobody wants to invest in it. Your cost of capital is dramatically higher if you're exposed to the coal industry or gas industry. Nobody wants to insure these projects either. So there might be some private capital that will actually invest in these projects, but public money markets is not going to support any of these projects. In terms of subsidies, it's a really vexed issue. I personally don't think the government should be directly subsidising any fossil fuels. But then there's a lot of, when things get calculated, there's a lot of indirect subsidies in there which go to all sorts of projects, and it's very difficult to untangle. So I'm gonna leave the subsidy question alone. But I would just say I think Australia does need to think very carefully about where our export markets are heading, and putting all of our eggs in fossil fuel exports is clearly just incredibly poor economics, as well as being very, very poor for the environment. But as I said, I think our customers are going to take care of this problem for us. They will not be buying these products from us in 15 years, so they are uninvestable.
Thanks, Yannick Spencer. Kate Cheney, I'll move to you on this question. How should we view our state and federal government's emission reduction pledges in light of the fact that all of these projects are ready to go, despite the fact that the IEA tells us otherwise?
So I think we definitely need to start with a level playing field where we are absolutely, for these projects, not putting any money in, not subsidising any fossil fuel projects from this point on, for a start at a very minimum, and even that would be an improvement. Basically, any fossil fuel projects approved that proceeds from here on makes the challenge harder in the future, and so we've got to really take that into account in deciding what we're prepared to let proceed. I probably agree a bit with Yannick in that I do think that market forces will play a part in this. Finance is increasingly hard to get, and there is a risk of stranded assets with a number of these projects. But I do think we need to have a level playing field and ensure that we are fully reflecting the true cost of these projects, whether that's through the safeguard mechanism and how that's used, or providing certainty. I know that Shell have built in a $40 price for carbon in all of their project approval processes in the last, 5 or 10 years, thinking that things have to stack up on that basis in order to be worth proceeding with. And providing that sort of certainty to the corporate sector, I think, would ensure that we are shifting the focus of our new projects into renewables and away from these fossil fuel projects.
Mm. Thanks, Kate Chaney. And Cameron, Pidgeon, to you on that question.
Yes, the message I get from the IEA statement about the fact that we need to end any new fossil fuel extraction is that we can no longer rely on market forces. So I have to disagree with Yannick and Kate. Market forces got us to where we are. If we set market mechanisms, say 15, 20 years ago, with a decent price on carbon, other disincentives and incentives to market-based incentives to transform to renewable energy, we might not be in the trouble we're in now. The IEA, which is basically a fossil fuel lobby, coming out and saying this means that it's too late. We have to take firm action on with government measures, with export licenses, saying no more for any existing underway pipeline gas projects and coal projects in the pipeline. I also disagree with Yannick was saying about subsidies. There's a lot of subsidy in terms of transport. Rail lines, for example, given tremendous government handouts. They are not there for anything but coal in the big rail lines in Queensland and up north that supported the ports. There's huge subsidies, but the biggest subsidies come in tax cuts. Most of the big gas companies up north pay little or no company tax and almost or no petroleum resource rent tax. The Greens want to introduce a resource rent tax for all the big industry, remove all the subsidies and the tax breaks they're getting, making sure that they pay tax on company tax, or remove the loopholes that will enable them to grandfather these tax breaks. And so our existing fossil fuel companies are paying their fair share of tax, the same proportion of tax that the rest of us are.
Okay, that's your time now, Cameron. Sorry to interrupt you again. Moving on now to a question about EVs. This one's from Christine. Air pollution from conventional vehicles has a significant health impact and health costs. Our vehicle emission standards are some of the worst in the world. Many Australians want to buy electric vehicles but are being held back by a lack of policy. What specific government policies do you believe are required to achieve widespread EV uptake in Australia? And are you committed to championing these? I'll go to you, Kate Chaney.
So definitely the easiest way to proceed with this, I think, is by increasing our vehicle standards so that they're consistent with the rest of the world. Because at the moment we are a few rungs down from the rest of the world on vehicle emission standards, and I would support that. There's been talk of EV subsidies, and I think it's something worth investigating. But at the moment, demand for electric vehicles exceeds supply on a global level, and there's a very long wait on vehicles. So it may be that subsidies are not the most effective thing at this point. One thing that I think government could do that wouldn't require legislation that takes 3 years to get passed is transition the government fleet to EVs, subject to the supply constraints. But that would mean that in 2 or 3 years, in the time that it takes for government to turn over its fleet, there would then be a secondary market in electric vehicles, which would make them much more accessible and affordable for more people in Australia. So I think that could be a good short-term policy or approach that government could take to create more of a market in EVs at the same time as the vehicle standards catch up with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Kate Cheney. Moving on, Cameron Pidgeon from the Greens, again, about EV uptake, and are you committed to championing government policies, and which do you think they should be?
All of them. No, that's a bit flip. There's a lot of things that can be done. We think that the for charging infrastructure, making sure so people are confident wherever they go, they've got at work, where they might leave their car for the whole day, they've got a charger there. Things we do believe a subsidy is wanted, even though there is a excess demand globally. But it's particular a problem in Australia with a huge demand and unmet supply. The car industry doesn't want to supply EVs to Australia because the pricing mechanisms aren't there, and as they are in other countries, we see that this is what has worked. So we have a policy for EV subsidies. We also see that there's room to reintroduce the car industry, manufacturing in Australia. EVs, one of their benefits is they've got a lot less moving parts, a lot less complexity than petrol cars. And that gives the Australian industry an opening where we can, perhaps to begin with, at least with imported batteries and motors, it'll be cheaper for us to manufacture EVs than it would have for petrol cars. And of course, it's been a long-standing policy of ours to get our exhaust and emission tax right and make sure that we have the same fuel standards or emission standards as the rest of the world. So there's a lot that government can do. There's a lot that we've been pushing for a long time. Let's do it now.
Thank you, Cameron Pidgeon. And moving on to Yannick Spencer.
Thanks. Yeah, again, on electric vehicles. I love electric vehicles. I really want one, but they're too expensive. And I simply can't afford an electric vehicle. And I think, as the questioner said, a lot of people want to buy an electric vehicle, but they are being held back. And I think for most people, the biggest challenge is the price. Is the price of an electric vehicle. They are more expensive currently than internal combustion engine vehicles. So Labor's policy is all about making those vehicles less expensive and removing other barriers to adoption. So we will subsidise electric vehicles, or subsidise is probably not quite the right word, but remove taxes from electric vehicles, which will have the effect of making them cheaper. We will also invest in charging infrastructure. One of the other barriers is range anxiety, particularly for people who live regionally or who have long commutes. So we will invest in charging infrastructure to make it easier to travel longer distances, which gives people the confidence to buy particularly smaller models of cars, which might have only a 200-kilometre range. And there's very few cars that have a longer range than, say, 400, 500 kilometres, and those are very, very expensive vehicles. So charging infrastructure really is important. And we want to manufacture components here as well, and where possible, manufacture vehicles here. So the final part of our policy is putting together with the states and territories a national electric vehicle strategy that will look at other policy incentives, potentially like fuel emission standards, tailpipe emission standards, to see what else we can do to incentivise uptake of electric vehicles, because transport is a big emitting sector. And if we can decarbonise the grid, then electrifying transport is a great way to cut emissions very quickly.
Thank you, Yannick Spencer. The next question from Louisa. Australian fossil fuel subsidies across all tiers of government hit $10.3 billion in 2020-2021. That's $22,000 every minute at a time when we need to urgently stop extracting and burning fossil fuels. Harvard University research indicates that fossil fuels are responsible for 1 in 5 deaths globally. What are you going to do to stop fossil fuel subsidies? I'll go to you first, Cameron Pidgeon.
We will oppose them and end them. We can see what how embedded the fossil fuel industry is in this country, and WA, possibly especially. There seems to be this perception that we need to export gas. And this is what's, along with iron ore, this is what supports our lifestyle and wealth. When you look at how little revenue in terms of royalties and taxation comes into the state, we don't get very much at all, unless you're an investor in those companies and with a decent size investment. But for the rest of us, there's not much benefit. So we've always been pointing out in the Parliament that this isn't working for us. The taxation system, well, the view seems to be we must give these subsidies, these tax breaks to industry, these fossil fuel industries in particular, because it supports our economy. We need the fossil fuels, even though they charge us more for gas than their international customers. It didn't have to be that way from the beginning. You look at places like Norway, where they charge a huge royalty on the oil they export, and they've done very well out of it. It hasn't destroyed their oil industry from the very start. The industry was not only kept going, but was able to establish itself under quite a harsh tax royalty system. So it seems to be some kind of frontier mentality we've got, where we have this perception, it's almost like we're saying to you, if you dig it up or pump it up, you can keep it, it's yours to sell. When you really, it's bizarre. We have to change it now. We can't afford to keep going the way we are.
That's your time now. Sorry, Cameron.
A long time in Parliament.
Sorry, Cameron. I don't know if you can see the chat, but there's a timer in the chat.
I do.
Okay, because I think you've got some supporters who are raging at me for interrupting you all the time, but you are getting your 2 minutes like the other speakers. Can I go to you now, Yannick Spencer, just to ask what you're going to do to stop fossil fuel subsidies?
Yeah, sure. So look, as I said before, I think the issue of subsidies to fossil fuel companies, it is complicated, and figures like the figure that was thrown out before go around. I'm not across where that figure has come from, but if you look at something like say the diesel excise rebate that's given to mining companies, I personally don't see that as a fossil fuel subsidy. Now, it's not saying whether I agree with it or not, but I wouldn't count it as a fossil fuel subsidy. What I would say is that I personally like a level playing field. I don't think that we should be subsidising one sector more than another unless we know that it's going to contribute to common good, which is why Labor wants to invest in sectors like green metals, renewables, component manufacturing, hydrogen electrolyzers, those sorts of things. We know that those things are going to be good for our economy, good for our environment, good for our public health. So we want to invest public money into those things where it should be. Labor is also committed to minimum tax rates for corporations across the globe. So companies that make use of various legal and sometimes less legal methods for minimising or avoiding tax, we will go after that to make sure that all large companies pay their fair share of tax, and I think that will end up including some of the fossil fuel companies that we're talking about. In terms of direct subsidies to fossil fuel projects, I personally can't see why those subsidies should be in place, but I don't believe that Labor currently has a policy to end particular programs.
Mm. Okay, thank you, Yannick. And Kate Chaney, I'll go to you on what you're going to do to stop fossil fuel subsidies.
So 3 things. Firstly, no new fossil fuel subsidies so that we do have a level playing field. And I believe of the just over 10 billion, about 8.5 billion is in fuel rebates, and the remainder is in subsidies to fossil fuel companies for things like carbon capture and storage, which is not working. So no new rebates, no new subsidies. Secondly, reviewing existing subsidies, and a lot of those fuel rebates are in farming or mining, and I think we really need to run a critical eye over that and determine whether they are genuinely required. And thirdly, transparency and political donations. We don't find out, you've got no idea who's funding the political campaigns of the major parties. Even next February, you'll only find out a small proportion of where the revenue comes from. Last year, it was 9% of the Liberal Party and 17% of the Labor Party. I'm running a fully transparent campaign where you can see exactly who donates to my campaign when in real time on my website, all cash donations. And there is no reason why every party shouldn't do that, so that we can be talking and understand in whose interests the major parties are actually making decisions before the election and not well after it.
Thank you, Kate. I'll go to you first on this next question too, which is from Emma, and it's about biodiversity. There is an unfolding global biodiversity crisis being driven primarily by land clearing and now increasingly pollution and climate change. Species extinction rates have increased by 100 to 1,000 times since the pre-industrial era. The loss of biodiversity threatens our agriculture, prosperity and health. Australia is the worst affected continent in terms of species loss. This undermines agricultural production and increases risks of infectious diseases and undermines heritage and cultural values related to land. And the question is, what will you do to halt the degradation of our natural environment? Kate Chaney.
It is really alarming. And sorry, am I on mute? No, I'm not. I've got a low battery. I'm hoping I get to the end. It's really alarming. And I think at the moment, climate change is the thing that is capturing more of the imagination than biodiversity. And the two are inextricably linked. And increasingly, we're seeing in the IPCC reports and other, authoritative reports that it's really important that we think of them both as being connected. My understanding is that Australia is participating in the Global Biodiversity Framework discussions at the moment, and it will be important that we comply with our obligations under that. And whatever moves we make on decarbonisation have to be really cognizant of biodiversity and the impact that we're having on that as well.
Thank you very much. Cameron Pidgeon, I'll go to you on this question of what will you do to halt the degradation of our natural environment?
I think one of the things we've been pushing for a lot is ending land clearing. We've already got huge amounts of land cleared for agriculture, for urban areas, ending deforestation, changing our forestry practices so it's not dependent on clear felling. We've got with our industry now, we know we can. We're building up towards an industry that's dependent on plantation timber without the need to go into keep cutting into our natural environment, our natural forests. So we need to make sure that we've got stronger regulations and laws around national parks, preserved areas, making sure that there's no that we're preserving space the way natural environment ecosystems are linked up. We're not carving up areas like with roads or urban development. We're trying to reintroduce, if possible, links between areas that are left. All this needs to be done to keep a natural environment, our ecosystems resilient as the climate changes. We've seen what happens with fires. We've seen desertification already in some parts over in drier areas where the natural species there are finding it hard to maintain themselves. So it's really about making it stick. It comes to accountability, making sure that we do what we say and have the laws that can enforce all these things.
Thank you. And moving on finally to Yannick Spencer on the question of what will you do to halt the degradation of our natural environment?
Sorry, yeah, I'm off mute. Yeah, again, so I think it's a really complicated and it is a really pressing issue. So some of the policies that Labor has in this area, we need to regenerate our soils. So investing in regeneration of soils through the $3 billion program that I mentioned earlier is a really key area. That soils can be a carbon sink, but too much land clearing has turned the soils barren in places. So that's the first part of it, is investing in soil regeneration and revegetation to native bush. Labor also has a $200 million fund for restoring urban rivers and catchments. So this is the rivers and waterways and wetlands that are in urban areas. And we're focused on urban areas in particular because over half of the threatened species, animal species across Australia, actually live in urban areas. They're not out in remote and regional Australia, they're in urban areas. And the majority of them congregate around water catchments. And the way that we treat our stormwater at the moment is basically, our rivers is basically as stormwater drains. So we need to invest in those urban rivers and catchments to bring, to slow down the flow of water so that animals and plants can live in them the way they used to. Labor's also committed to the Indigenous Ranges program. We know that there has been the longest continuous culture lives in this country, and they know how to manage the land. That's why Labor will invest in doubling the Indigenous Ranges program so that we can learn from that inherited knowledge in how to look after our country. And WA Labor also has made the commitment to end old growth native logging in the state and protect native forests.
Thank you. That's time, Yannick. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for just a really quick whip around, one last question before we go to Professor Fiona Stanley to wrap up for the evening. And this one comes from Yvonne. AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, says the rate of wind and solar additions on the country's main grid means Australia can be well ahead of its most optimistic renewable transition scenario of 90% renewable energy penetration by 2040. What will you do to accelerate the transition of our grid to renewables? I'll go to you, Cameron, on that one.
We agree. Our target is getting coal off the grid, coal generation off the grid by 2030. That's, in a way, as the others have said tonight, it's happening already. But there needs to be legislation to make sure that it's going to happen in an orderly way, that the grid's prepared for that we have the renewables there to displace coal generation. But as you've just said, the renewable generation is happening quite quickly with the projects we've got in the pipeline already. We could get 2/3 to the way of getting renewable fossil fuels generation off the grid by 2030. And that's with a government that has probably done more to hinder that development, renewable energy, than it has to help. So if we get a government that actually is promoting fossil fuels, is taking steps to ensure the grid is ready, that there's storage in place, reliable, dependable energy, then it's going to happen a lot faster. I think the industry will have a lot more confidence. We're also proposing to actually directly fund that supply to make sure it happens in adequate time, and directly fund renewable energy projects.
Thank you very much, Cameron. And Yannick, I know you've talked about this a little bit already, but just to return to it, what will you and Labor do to accelerate the transition of our grid to renewables?
Yeah, so it's a really good point that's been raised by the questioner. And AEMO, yes, they are very bullish on renewable energy, and they absolutely should be. So at the rate that renewable energy is going in, we could get to 90%, but that brings challenges with it because of intermittency of renewable energy, and the fact that you have renewable energy projects all scattered all around the country. And so what you need to do is make the grid able to handle that penetration of renewable energy. And that's what Labor is proposing through the Rewiring the Nation component of the Powering Australia policy. And that is all about investing in the transmission network. So it's investing in high voltage transmission lines so that you can get renewable energy from the places where it's being generated to the places where it needs to be consumed, because they're not always the same place. So if you look at the East Coast market now, New South Wales and Queensland, which are heavily coal reliant at the moment, are paying more for power than South Australia and Victoria are, which have much higher penetrations of renewable energy. We need to get that renewable energy to where it needs to be, and that's why we invest in transmission. We also need to invest in storage, large-scale storage and community storage, and we need to invest in reliability in the distribution network, so that areas that have high penetrations of rooftop solar can actually soak that up, export it back to the grid, store it in community batteries, use people's batteries behind the meter. So we need to invest in the network, because the economics of large scale and small scale renewables are so good that they are displacing coal and gas very, very rapidly, but the network can't deal with that. So I think investing in that will give those signals to the market that Cameron was talking about, that people can invest with confidence, knowing that the market can take that.
Thank you, Yannick. And finally to you, Kate Chaney, on what you'll do to accelerate the transition of our grid to renewables.
So the grid, the infrastructure definitely needs some work to make sure that it can handle it. I mean, over here, bringing it back to a more local question, our network is quite separate to the Eastern States network. And in some ways, we're really well positioned to start with that, with increased renewables by picking off the edges of our own grid where the energy is more expensive, and gradually reducing the size of the grid within the Swiss network in the southwest part of Australia. There are some great initiatives that would accelerate things as well, like the Solar Our Schools initiative that looks at putting solar panels and batteries on all the primary schools and childcare centres in Australia. So you know that they are close to where the people are. The kids go home at 3 o'clock just when the air conditioners are going on, and over the summer holidays at the peak of everyone using their air conditioners, there's no one at school. The benefit of something like that is you also then build a skilled workforce who have experience in installing batteries and build that industry and potentially reduce the prices. So I think there are initiatives like that can have a really big impact on accelerating that. But obviously electricity grids are very complex, and we need to ensure that we can that we have constant power through that, and the grid is able to deal with it, with those changes.
Yeah. Kate, thank you very much. And that wraps up the Q&A session for tonight. And thank you so much to Cameron Pidgeon from the Greens, Yannick Spencer from Labor, and Kate Chaney, Independent for Curtin, for joining us this evening. And for the energetic chat that has been going on in the sidelines there as well, I'd like to hand over to Professor Fiona Stanley to wrap up this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone. Have we got about 2 more hours to go through all the chat and the other questions? Because this has been a fantastic debate. One of the questions is where's the coalition? I'll leave that one standing, but it might not have been so agreeable if that person had come. But I mean, there's so much going on in people's minds with all 3 candidates that's so encouraging and so positive that I really feel very good about it. There were some things that I thought were not mentioned as much as they could, and certainly some of the chats said that. Are we still going to support growth and jobs and continuous growth? Isn't continuous growth on this planet an oxymoron when we're so, this is the only planet we've got, there is no planet B. And the way that we live and consume, I don't think was touched upon perhaps as much as it could be, except in relation to things like electric vehicles and things that we've been talking about in terms of how you use renewables during the day. There's questions about, can we leave coal to the markets? Why is Scarborough going ahead? So these are the sorts of questions that I think some of the chat people think, which I actually agree to as well. For those people in the interstate, our Scarborough is a big new gas hub off the coast of Western Australia, which has just got support from the government. So I think there's a question there about whether we can leave it to the markets, and if there's not ways in which we could actually encourage, and that's where we want this national strategy that we've all been calling for, and I think every one of the candidates agrees that we need a national strategy. The other thing that I thought, which I loved you all talking about biodiversity and the fact that we need to look after our soils and our water, of course, which is the huge issue for WA in particular. I don't think, and this is my bias, there was enough discussion about science and data and what the data that we need to monitor what we're doing. And that's incredibly important. And that's why we need a national centre for, at least for population health and wellbeing, which in fact going to bring all these collaborations together. I think you're all absolutely right that this is going to take a huge change in how we work together. We've got a very, very split, polarised government in democracy in Australia at the moment. And if anything that we hope that you guys can do is to try and get some of that, bipartisan support, quadripartisan support for the things that absolutely shouldn't be debated. That in fact, I love the idea of the scientists now giving advice and the politicians having to follow it, as we did in COVID. I probably have to stop there, don't I, Mary? But there are just so many, I'm excited, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm worried. I think we all need to be. But good luck to all of you. We're hanging on you to make a change in this country, and I hope that you can do so. I just want to thank everyone who's been involved in this debate tonight. Obviously the Doctors for the Environment, and I want to particularly thank Dr. Emily Sinnott, who organised this. I want to thank you, Mary, for a wonderful emceeing, and I also want to thank Kate Noonan from the AMA and Ian Tozer from the ARRCC, because all of that is just very important. And a special thanks to Mitchell Garlit, if you're still there. That was a beautiful, heartfelt, Mort welcome to country. Thank you all very, very much indeed. I hope it has been a very interesting event for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.